We are pretty much right on schedule to start our virtual horse management seminar of 2024. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Carrie Williams. For those of you who've never been on one of my programs, I am the equine extension specialist at Rutgers University. I've been here 20 years. I'm also a professor in the department and hold several roles with teaching, extension, and research. So this is our 4th year, I believe, of doing some virtual seminars. They all started during COVID. However, we've had such a fantastic response. I've decided to keep them. As you can see right now, we're running at 182 attendees, which is fantastic. Very few of my extension colleagues across the country rarely get this many attendees. So we've decided that we will keep them virtual. However, 2024 was our first year back in person. We were able to have in-person seminars now. And actually, we would have been able to last year, but it took a little bit of rebuilding. So if you are at our seminars, you get a few new speakers, as well as some returning speakers from our live seminar, which was on February 3rd. So with that being said, I want to do something fun and see about everybody and see who you are. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you are on your phone or another browser or some other IT device, I want you to all go to menti.com, and that is MENTI.com. So I'm going to give you guys just a little bit. Go find menti.com, and trust me, it's fun, and I really want everybody to do this. So please go to menti.com, and then I'm going to give you just a little bit more. Yeah, so menti.com, and then Kyle has in the chat. So if you're seeing that, you're going to have to enter a code, and that code is 940768872, and he's going to remind you several times about that. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up the Mentimeter, and I have a couple of questions for you. So the first question, and you have to read it carefully, because do not abbreviate. That's the most important thing. And I see a couple of you didn't read carefully. Do not abbreviate. And the reason why I don't want you to abbreviate what your state or your country is because everybody's has to look the same to make the words bigger. So if you put NJ instead of New Jersey, you're not going to get counted, and you're not going to make our word bigger. Okay, so this is just asking what state or country you are listening from. And the reason why I like to do this is because I always challenge myself to get all 50 states. I think one year we came about 38, I think was kind of the closest we came. But yeah, it was a lot of fun to see all the different states and even what countries. So far I'm seeing all US based. Ooh, I do see a Portugal. Welcome, Portugal. And I love watching all the words change. Oh, and I just want everybody to know I picked pink in honor of Valentine's Day tomorrow. So happy Valentine's Day, everybody. That is why we have the pink background. And we're still getting people. You can see down in the lower right-hand corner, we have 107 of you logging on and taking the Menti poll, and I love it. Oh, we have Brazil. Thank you, Brazil. And then we have Florida, Michigan, Canada. There's a Canadian. Awesome. Thank you. Washington, Nevada, California. So we have spanned quite a large range of the country. So thank you very much. And Russia, there's another unique one. I don't know that we've had anybody from Russia before, but welcome. Thank you. So I'm going to let you guys keep going with this, but I'm going to change the screen to the next one. The next one will be just kind of how you are affiliated with horses. So you're allowed 3 responses. So what is your primary interaction with horses? Meaning, if you're primarily a trainer, but you also own horses, you can say that. And obviously, if you're here, you're an enthusiast, but you can pick that one as well. Or if you're a veterinarian, but own your own horse, etc. So you can pick up 2, 3 choices. So this is kind of a way that we can see kind of what everybody else is. And if you would do me a favor, I know there's an other category, and there's a lot of others. And a lot of times in other, we get things like a certified path instructor or therapy. So go ahead in the chat, and I'll read a few of them off. Go ahead and tell me what your other is. What is your other? Extension specialist, love those. Thank you. Awesome. Path instructor. Yep, there we go. Path instructor. LVT. What is an LVT? If you don't mind, Anne, explaining that. Another path instructor, boarding and training facility owner. Great. Igala. Awesome. Excellent. So it does seem like most of you, 94 are horse owners, 63 now horse enthusiasts, 26 trainers, 25 barn owners. And again, these have some overlap. Some are barn owners. I should have actually put that in there. That's a good point. Next time, I think I need to add barn owner as well as barn manager. So awesome. We have 126 on now. Let's go back to our states and see if that's changed at all. See if we have any others. We do have quite a few states. So awesome. Welcome to everybody. I'm happy that everybody's here. From near and far. So thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over because now that I've learned a little bit about you, I want you guys to learn a little bit about us. So I'm going to welcome you again to our equine horse management seminar. This is day 1. So good news, we have 2 more days coming and totally different topics each day. So I'm going to also introduce you to our Equine Science Center. And in order to do that, we have a little video, about a 2-minute video for you to watch. So I am going to be quiet for a minute, rest my voice, and have you listen to this little video.
Good morning. Welcome to the George H. Cook campus, home of the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, and of course, home to the Rutgers Equine Science Center. Equine Science Center is a soft-walled center where we bring together the best and the brightest to solve challenges impacting horses, horse well-being, and the horse industry. To provide you more details about the research being conducted at the Equine Science Center, and specifically the Equine Exercise Physiology Lab, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kenneth McKeever.
The lab was founded in 1995, and since then it's been one of the most productive research labs in the country, if not the world. We've conducted studies looking at how to care for the aged horse. That's a horse that's over 20. We've looked at various drugs that affect performance. We've even done studies for the Army looking at food extracts that can reduce inflammation. So the Equine Science Center and the Equine Exercise Physiology Lab are a valuable asset to how we care for horses in the state of New Jersey.
So we've all visited this morning the Equine Exercise Physiology Lab, part of the Equine Science Center at Rutgers. We have another facility where cutting-edge research is being carried out, located on Riders Lane, and it is the site of the first of its kind environmental best management practices demonstration horse farm, located here on the George H. Cook campus. The team of scientists who are helping horse farmers become better environmental stewards and caretakers of the land is a team of multidisciplinary faculty, students, and staff led by Dr. Carrie Williams, Dr. Mike Westendorf, PhD student Jennifer Weinhardt, and other faculty, students, and staff from different departments here at Rutgers and beyond.
Hello, I'm Dr. Carrie Williams, the Equine Extension Specialist here at Rutgers University and the Associate Director of Extension for the Equine Science Center. We are here at the Environmental Best Management Practice Demonstration Horse Farm. This serves as a wonderful venue for the public, farm owners, other industry professionals to come look and see the 8 various best management practices, educational venues that they can use on their farm or in their areas. It is open to the public. You can come anytime. This venue also serves as a great location for research. My current graduate student, Jennifer Weinhardt, is looking at both cool season and some novel warm season grasses to see the production as well as the horse's metabolism. Some glucose and insulin responses as well as the microbiome will be looked at over the next 2 years of this project. Thank you for visiting all of us at the Equine Science Center. Our website can be found at esc.rutgers.edu.
that just gives you a little bit of an idea about who we are. The Equine Science Center also funds a lot of research projects, and listed on your screen is a few of them that they are currently funding. We would love to have your support for projects more like this, and also some more programs like we're doing here, also programs in person. So if you're interested in giving back to the Equine Science Center to do more outstanding research, teaching, and extension, please visit our website and donate. No amount is too little. So with that being said, I am going to introduce our first speaker. I also want to re-mention, for those of you who have logged on a little bit late and missed it, if you have questions for the speaker, even during the talk, please put them in the Q&A down at the bottom, not in the chat box. I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A, and I'm going to be moderating questions at the end. So we'll be able to have the questions, but please put them in the Q&A box. If you have any IT problems or any panelist particular questions, you can put those in the chat, but not those for the speaker. Okay, so with that being said, I am excited to introduce Dr. Matt Elmore. He is a colleague of mine and an associate extension specialist at Rutgers University. Matt joined Rutgers about 6 years ago as it was a brand new position in weed science. It's a weed science extension specialist. He's in turfgrass, landscape, pastures, and forages. Matt earned his BS in turfgrass science from Penn State University before moving south and earning his MS and PhD from the University of Tennessee with a focus on turfgrass weed control. Prior to joining Rutgers, Matt was a turfgrass extension specialist at Texas A&M AgriLife in Dallas, Texas, where his research efforts explored new strategies to control problematic weeds and reduce irrigation inputs in turfgrass. His program at Rutgers has focused on novel strategies to control weeds with fewer pesticide inputs, and the program also focuses on significant efforts to develop alternatives to synthetic pesticides and understanding the influence of management and practices on weed competitiveness. So while Matt is pulling up his video or his PowerPoint, I'm going to let him take it over and say thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear here.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me out. And a little bit like Carrie, I'm also getting over the flu. I think I'm probably a little farther to it than she is, but I probably will have to interrupt with some coughing here. And I'll do my best to avoid it. All right. So we're going to talk about weed management in horse pastures, which Carrie gave my introduction. It's a lot of turf grass you probably heard in there, but there are actually a lot of similarities between turf grass and pastures. One of the big differences is that pastures are mowed a lot less, but otherwise there's probably more things similar about the two systems than is different. So let's just start out and talk about very simply what is a weed, right? Because one thing that's a plant that's a weed to one person might not be a weed to another person. This here is not an example of a pasture weed, but this is morning glory in both the picture on the left and on the right. And so obviously the morning glory on the left is an ornamental plant, and on the right it is a rather problematic weed in a cornfield, right? And so there's a picture of the morning glory kind of tying up the corn and will make it difficult to harvest and whatnot. So and something that's a weed to some of you in this room, especially those of you in the South, might not be a weed to those of us in the North, or vice versa. So the definition of a weed is basically, this is from the European Weed Research Society, but basically what I want to show here is that a weed is in the eye of the beholder. So any plant vegetation that interferes with the objectives or requirements of people is considered a weed. So again, in one situation, a certain plant might be considered a weed and others not. So, keep that in mind as you're going through the presentation tonight. In the Oxford English Dictionary, similar, right? It talks about superior versus inferior vegetation. So then the common theme there is, right, it's up to us to decide what is a weed. So this is certainly not an inclusive list, but some of the weeds of the horse pasture. The top of the list is just, again, a couple that are common. And these are typically avoided by the animals. And actually, most of them on this list are almost always avoided by the animals, but some of them are avoided for various reasons, right? So things like curly dock and horseweed are really common weeds that basically just reduce the carrying capacity of the field or the ability of the field to produce forage, right? If you have a field that's mostly, for example, this 30% curly dock, which is a broadleaf weed, and we'll talk about weed classifications and those sorts of things. It's just going to be able to provide 30% less forage to the horse. There are other weeds like foxtails, horse nettle, and we'll see pictures of all these later. Thistles, you might be familiar with. These can actually cause physical injury to the horses if they were to eat them. Then there are toxic weeds as well. And again, these are toxic, but they are almost always avoided by the animal. The most common one probably being buttercup. Again, you can see pastures covered in this stuff, and the animals do a pretty good job avoiding it. Obviously, it's reducing the quality and carrying capacity of the pasture. But so those are, again, just some of the different weeds. And we want to talk about the desirable species as well, because those are the ones that we're going to want to promote. And we'll talk about that as we go through tonight. So primarily, desirable species are grasses, right? And we've got cool season grasses, and it looks like most of the audience is from cool season growing areas. So that would be, New Jersey, even down into Virginia, Kentucky, you might be still growing a lot of cool season forage there. So primarily what we're looking at is tall fescue, orchard grass, sometimes Kentucky bluegrass, and then the smooth brome grass, timothy, and you've got legumes like clover and those sorts of things, and alfalfa. I would say those are kind of more often minority components, and maybe not so much the legumes, but these two are probably minority components. Again, primarily, I think what we're focused on is tall fescue, and usually you've got some orchard grass and Kentucky bluegrass in there. And then warm season grasses. So those of you from, I guess I saw Portugal in here and Brazil, you're probably focused more on growing Bermuda grass, potentially Bahia grass, crabgrass, and maybe there's some other grasses I'm not even listing here. But what I want to do is mostly just contrast when these two different grasses like to grow, warm season versus cool season. And also because we're going to talk about weeds that have what I would call primarily a warm season growth calendar or life cycle, and also weeds that have a cool season growth calendar. So you're going to want to think about that, where we have our cool season grasses and also our weeds. They're going to grow very rapidly in terms of shoot growth in the spring, right? You're all probably pretty familiar with this. And the forage production tends to, with these, decline during the summertime, and then we'll get another rebounding growth in the fall. And also we'll get a lot of root growth and recovery from that summer stress period in the fall. And so when we're primarily growing cool season forages, this fall period is actually really important in terms of recovery and rejuvenation of that pasture. If we're going to seed grasses, we're going to want to do it in the fall and not in the springtime. You can make some recovery gains in terms of the grass in the springtime, but mostly if you're planning for the long term, you're going to want to kind of address those things in the fall. We'll talk about that. Whereas the warm seasons are the opposite, where they're going to grow very rapidly during the summer, and the warmer it gets, the more they'll grow. Even if it's 95 degrees out, as long as there's good moisture, they're going to grow very rapidly. But for example, in New Jersey, a Bermuda grass or a crabgrass, which I would consider commonly a weed of a pasture in New Jersey, crabgrass, I would consider it a weed because it's really only going to grow for about 3 months of the year in New Jersey, and the rest of the time it's going to have outcompeted our desirable forage for space. So those are kind of some of the things that we're thinking about, right? We need to know what our desirable species are so we can try to get rid of the non-desirable species. And we've kind of talked about this concept already in terms of weeds. So we're going to talk a little bit about weed biology and life cycle for the next 10 minutes or so. And then we are going to sort of go through a calendar year in, I'd say, more the northern United States in terms of weed problems, although this will apply a little bit to more to warmer climates. So that's what we're going to do, right? So we're going to learn how to identify a little bit about identifying weeds, more about how do we classify the weeds, and then we'll actually go through again some common weeds and how to control them. So identification of the weed is important. If you can actually get to knowing what the species is, then you have a better chance at being able to understand the life cycle and when's the best time to control it. You'll be able to look up resources on the best way to control that weed. So identification is important. There are weed ID galleries from various universities. Rutgers weed ID gallery is a little bit outdated right now, but again, there are other options. The phone apps right now actually are getting better, particularly for broadleaf species. Dicots we'll talk about, not really going to be that great for grasses quite yet. With the phone apps, the way I use those is if I don't know what a particular weed is, particularly again a broadleaf weed, which I'll explain what that means later, but I will use the app to take a picture of it, and then if I get a positive ID, then I will actually, write the name of that species down, go look up some more high quality images from, reputable weed ID galleries from a university, for example, and say, oh yeah, those definitely match. This is definitely what I have, right? Rutgers Cooperative Extension has good resources for weed identification. If you're really stumped, the Rutgers Plant Diagnostic Lab, which is actually right across the street from the Equine Science Center that we saw in the video. You can send them an actual sample of the weed, and I believe that it does cost. I think it's maybe $30 or something, but you can send them a live sample, and they will give you an identification. So the main reason we want to know is what the weed is because it depends on the weed species impacts what we decide to do to control it, right? Something that works on one broadleaf weed might not work quite as well on another, as we'll see. The implications of the weed population as well, how serious of a problem is this? And then the other one is the life cycle, the weed biology. All right, and so we'll talk a little bit about, I want to go, hopefully this isn't too basic, I guess, or too fundamental, but I want to talk about the weeds in pastures, because what we'll see, commonly is actually a lot of pastures get into this overgrazing situation, and that's actually why we have a lot of weed invasions in pastures, right? In this situation, we don't have enough competition from the desirable forage to outcompete the weeds. And there are certain weeds that, particularly in this situation, we've got a lot of bare ground, we'll take advantage of that. And if we go to our kind of plant succession, where this is a concept kind of looking at how, plant communities evolve over time, right? And whenever the earth was much older than it is now, right? We had bare rock. Eventually that rock was weathered, and we started to get soil, and that soil could support small annual plants and lichens. And these would be pioneer species. These would be your first invaders into an open area. And, commonly these plants, these small annual plants, are really common invaders in agricultural fields and other places where we've got a lot of disturbance. We want to move in a pasture. We want to be a little bit farther along here in terms of that succession, right? We want to be supporting perennial grasses. That is the desirable species. But if we're continually in this overgrazing situation where we've got this lots of soil exposure and those sorts of things, we're going to basically invite these small annual plants to be there. They're going to be the most competitive, and so they're going to get a foothold, and we're constantly going to be spraying herbicides and kind of fighting from behind here if we don't have good quality forage. Because if we can get into this sort of situation here, these annual plants become less competitive. They just don't establish because that's not really their ecological niche. So obviously, if we were to let that succession go, we can go more towards intermediate species, grasses, shrubs, and even trees. And in a pasture, we can see this situation as well, particularly because this is what happens, this, as we move towards the right here, this intermediate species and ultimately the climax community in New Jersey and many parts of the East Coast of the United States and others is basically a forest, right? And if we remove all the disturbance completely, then we end up with a forest. And basically, if we start ending up with a lot of these intermediate species, talk about shrubs and those sorts of things, we won't get into that too much today. But if I start to get, invasive tree questions in a pasture, it's likely that we have so little disturbance that those trees are allowed to establish. And basically, we need to introduce some disturbance, which is basically just mowing. And we need to mow that pasture more frequently so that these intermediate species don't establish. We want to kind of try to keep it to grasses and perennials. Again, too much disturbance from overgrazing. We're favoring those annual plants, which are problematic. Not enough disturbance. Maybe the animals are grazing the grass, but they're not grazing these trees and things that come up, so that can be a problem as well. Right, so overgrazing is probably the biggest issue in pastures in terms of weed establishment. So a lot of what we'll talk about tonight is kind of just good pasture management. And what I would encourage you to do is to look at some of the fact sheets from the Equine Science Center and other places about, okay, what's the proper way to establish a really competitive forage crop, whether it's the tall fescue, mixed with orchard grass or whatever it is, or it's your warm season grass. But, the key thing is often the pastures are just overgrazed. So if you can section things out into paddocks and rotate the animals to prevent overgrazing. Often mowing, as you see here in the picture, 3 to 4 times per year. If you're starting to get shrubs and trees that become weed problems, then you want to increase that mowing frequency to 3 or 4 times a year. And this is a big one. Soil testing and nutrient management is going to allow that grass forage to be more competitive and also to produce more forage for the animal. And obviously there's certain ways to do that where you don't want to push too much nitrogen in the system at once that'll reduce the quality of the forage and that kind of thing. So look up those extension guides. But, in general, the thing that's going to drive the growth of the grass is nitrogen. And that's by and large, that's pretty much it if we're on a relatively good soil and our pH isn't too acidic, right? So for in the coastal New Jersey, you could occasionally get phosphorus, potassium deficiency, those sorts of things. So it is good to, once, if you haven't done it in a while, to take a soil test and send it to the soil testing lab. It's less than $10 to have the soil tested. It won't give you information on nitrogen, but it'll give you that pH, which if it's too low, it's going to throw off a lot of the other nutrients that are going to be available to the forage. It'll give you an idea on that. And then from there, it's really up to getting the nitrogen management right. Fertilizing with nitrogen periodically at the appropriate time to make that grass forage more competitive, because the growth of the grass is really limited by nitrogen. And then once we get that part, started, we can talk about herbicides, but we'll talk about herbicides a lot tonight. But, if you're not managing the forage grass correctly, then you're just going to be on a treadmill where you're constantly spraying herbicides. So potentially renovating that pasture as well. If you've got too many weeds, we'll talk about that. You want to seed, and in our cool season pastures, excuse me, that's going to be best in the late summer or early fall. So we're talking like late August through kind of mid-September. It's not going to be as likely to be successful if you're doing a bunch of seeding in the spring, right? If you really are in a spot, you can make it work, but it's very challenging. All right, so let's talk about weed classification here for a bit. All right, so I kind of broke it into 2 groups here. We've got our broadleaves or our dicot weeds, and then we've got our monocot weeds, which includes grasses, which are desirables, but also weeds. Other classes of monocots are lilies, sedges, and that kind of thing, and some others. But again, by and large, it's really, is it a broadleaf or is it a grass within the monocot? And if we can get it narrowed down there, we're off to a good start, right? So broadleaf or dicot plants, here's an example of one that's not particularly problematic in forages, but I like it because it shows the leaf, the veination on that leaf. So you see these veins that are kind of in this branch kind of formation, right? Where you've got the main vein there, and then you see all this branching off, and this leaf, I think, shows that very well. That's a key indicator of a dicot species. Again, generally refer to them as broadleaf species. Okay, so monocots, the botanical definition is plants whose seedling bears only one cotyledon. How many times do we actually see seedling weeds that we can identify in the field? So really what we're looking at is are the leaf veins in parallel? And I'll show a picture of that in a second. And again, these are some major categories there. But again, grass is one seed leaf. Here's an example of a grass, right? This is goose grass. But you can just see the veins on these leaves are all running in parallel. We can contrast that with this wild violet plant here, where we've got that netted, or sometimes called reticulate leaf veination. So again, that's a really easy way to know, do I have a dicot or do I have a grass? Right. So here's an example of a grass. This is Dallas grass. We don't see a lot of this in New Jersey, although there's some. This is actually this was introduced as a forage grass back, I believe, in the 1700s. So you might see a lot of this for those of you in the southern United States. But anyways, getting off topic, this is a grass, right? You see the long, slender leaves. If you were to look close at this, the leaf veins would be in parallel. We can talk a little bit about sedges. I don't believe they're too problematic in pastures, but sedges are a different type of monocot. They're different than grasses. We talk about them differently because they're controlled differently than grasses, but sedges just have these triangular stems, right? So you can kind of see how this stem is rather triangular. If you were to cut it off and look at a cross section of it. So that's the big difference between grasses and sedges. Here's another picture of a sedge triangular stem, and you can see how instead of the leaves being opposite or 180 degrees from one another like they would be on a grass, we go look back at this grass, right? You can see the leaves are opposite one another 180 degrees, and they kind of pair off on the stem. Whereas a sedge, you can see how they're 120 degrees apart there if we're looking from the top, right? So it's called a three-ranked leaf arrangement. But anytime you get, excuse me, the leaves coming off of the stem, they're going to be in this kind of three-ranked arrangement with a sedge species or a Kalinga, which is, again, a sedge species. Here's just another look at that from the top. All right, so that's very basic weed classification. And we will control broadleaf weeds differently than grasses, differently than sedges. So that's why I'm harping on this so much. But let's kind of go through the calendar year, at least in the northern hemisphere, and talk about weeds of winter. Here we are in winter right now. So what are some weeds you might be seeing in the pasture right now, and what do we need to be thinking about them? So here's an example of one, a wild garlic. This is a monocot, but not a grass. It has a hollow cylindrical stem, and it is a perennial, so it's not an annual. So we'll talk about annual versus perennial in a second. But basically, perennial means it survives the entire year. These kind of smell like garlic or onion when they're crushed. Generally, we can get some post-emergence herbicides that will provide some suppression, but this is a very short-lived perennial. So what you actually see if you were to dig this up underground here, you see a bunch of bulbs, tiny little bulbs. And basically the wild garlic shoots will emerge from these bulbs in midwinter. And if you go outside right now, you can actually see this stuff. And the leaves will be very short-lived. And then it will just go dormant for most of the year. So it's really not a problem for the animals, especially because at this period of the year and in the next month or two, probably through like early April, we'll see this and then it'll fade away. The forage isn't really growing, so it's not necessarily the best time to have the animals out on the pasture anyway. Here's a very similar species. This actually is toxic to horses. But again, it's a very short-lived plant. You can see the bulbs here. This is how it survives the summer as a perennial, right? The leaf tissue above the ground exists for a short period of time. And I'll show you some more pictures in a second, and then it kind of just fades and the desirable forage usually takes over. So here's another picture. Again, Star Bethlehem. You can differentiate it from the wild onion and wild garlic, typically by this white midrib here that you can see on these leaves. Here's a picture of that bunch of Star Bethlehem in a grass, right? And this is, again, it's growing mostly very early in the springtime. And so, yes, you can get suppression from post-emergence herbicides. You could spot treat with something like Roundup. But generally, I think this isn't really growing much. And so it's whenever the forage is actively growing, so you don't have to worry about that toxicity. Here's a picture of those Star Bethlehem flowers, which usually show up for just a couple days in the spring or in the late winter. So now we're kind of moving to weeds of spring, although the time period between what we just looked at and these weeds is probably, not more than a couple weeks or a month, but this would be very early spring. We might see things like this. You might see them in your yard, but you also might see them in the pasture. And I don't believe that either of these are toxic. But again, if you see a lot of winter annual weeds, then that probably means that the forage crop itself is relatively thin. And that's something that you want to address either in the spring or more ideally in the fall. We want to get a denser grass crop. We want to be fertilizing more with nitrogen, or we need to figure out a pH issue, or more likely, we need to probably fertilize a little bit more and also seed some desirable forage in that late August, September time frame. Because again, we talked about that succession earlier. If we see a lot of annuals like these, mouse ear chickweed, common chickweed, it's not necessarily a huge problem, but it's indicative of a poor quality stand of forage because these weeds will only establish where there's bare ground. They're annual, so they establish from seed every year. I'll show you the life cycle right here. And that seed is not going to get a foothold in a really dense stand of forage. So winter annual growth in New Jersey, I say perennial here, but this is actually mostly annual. But basically those winter annuals, so these plants that we just looked at here, these are going to germinate in September or October. So again, if you have thin forage at that point, those weeds are going to see an opening for sunlight, other resources. They're going to get a foothold. They're going to grow through the winter. They're going to, when it's really cold out, they won't grow much. And then we'll get this big burst of growth in the springtime when and then they enter the reproductive flowering phase. So as annuals will die at that point, they'll set seed. Those seeds will just sit in the soil all summer before they germinate again in the fall. The only difference between an annual and a perennial is that a winter perennial will just typically be dormant all summer from bulbs or whatever it is. It won't be officially dead, right? It's just dormant. So another weed of springtime are buttercups. This is a big one. These contain a toxic oil that irritates the mouth and the digestive tract. Again, horses, from my understanding, are really good at grazing around this stuff, even in fields that are full of it. But this is much like the annual weeds we just looked at. It's indicative of a relatively poor quality forage, and it's only really going to get established in great intensity, I guess, where we have a poor quality thin forage. This weed just is not competitive where we've got that dense stand of forage, right? So here's an example of a field of buttercups in the springtime. It looks pretty, but the horse isn't finding as much there as it would like to. So here are the different species of buttercup. I'm not going to get into the different species really tonight, but bulbous buttercups, probably one of the most common ones in this area. Creeping buttercup, tall buttercup, small flower buttercup. Generally, they kind of behave as perennials, but they can be kind of weak perennials. So buttercup here on the left, and just don't mistake it for lesser celandine, which is on the right. And this is a little much, I guess, tougher to control here. So just you kind of see the difference in the leaf shape between the two of them. Here's some more buttercup pictures, right? So this is bulbous buttercup, and you can see it gets its name from this bulbous structure here, which is basically just storing carbohydrates for unfavorable periods. But again, pictures of buttercup here, you can see even in these pictures, right, we've got a bunch of moss, it looks like, around this buttercup plant. This one, there's not a lot of desirable forage there. So that's where these plants are competitive. All right, and so how do we control them? We'll talk a little bit more detail about herbicides later, but I wanted to get into a little bit of control here before we got too much further. So The key thing is I've talked about is working to establish a better forage. That's key for the long term. Short term, herbicides can definitely be used. The key thing with buttercup is it's relatively easy to control. I wouldn't say with one application in 1 year, but you don't have to use the most expensive herbicides to get buttercup under control. Just simple things like 2,4-D or 2,4-D plus dicamba or 2,4-D plus triclopyr will get the job done. But you have to apply it before the buttercup is in bloom. And obviously that's easier said than done because usually we don't notice the buttercups until they bloom. So this is a fairly early spring endeavor, right? For us in New Jersey, you can adjust your calendar north or south, depending on your experience. But that late March to early April application before bloom is going to work a lot better than if we wait until they bloom. And we'll see why a little bit later when we talk about thistles. So it will take multiple years to get this under control, but a spring application probably followed by something to improve the quality of that forage, whether it's, stronger fertility program or whatever, will work hand in hand. Another one I'll talk about, this is as we get a little bit farther into spring, we'll start to see thistles. Some Canada thistle would be one of the most problematic. Here is a picture of Canada thistle. It's got these small flowers, which will emerge you'll see in late spring. But a lot of times what you see here is on the left side of the screen, it's in this rosette sort of vegetative stage, and there's spines all over the leaves of this stuff, and so the animals won't want anything to do with it. So again, going to be problematic in your forage, right? Here's what it might look like from above in a fescue. And this is why what we're looking at here are the structures that make Canada thistle so difficult to control. So it is a perennial, much like buttercup, but it's a much stronger perennial than buttercup. And it's going to take, I'll call them, for the sake of simplicity, some higher powered herbicides to get it done. So you've got these rhizomes underground that if we make an application of an herbicide over the top of the field, something like aminopyrrolid, which is going to be one of those stronger herbicides that's good on thistle. So that would be Milestone would be the trade name. If we make an application on the top, we actually hope that herbicide translocates all the way down through the stem and actually kills off, these rhizomes underground, which the plant can actually regenerate from. And if you start digging up a stand of thistle, you'll see all these rhizomes, which we're looking at on the right side of the screen. And so usually controlling thistle is a multi-year endeavor with good herbicides. Again, we want to avoid making those applications during bloom. I'm not going to get too much into the details of what we're looking at here, but just very simply, this is a experiment where they tracked where the aminopyrrolid herbicide moved in the plant. So they put it here on the plant in one spot, and basically wherever you can see the shadow of the leaves, the herbicide is there, and the darker that shadow, the more herbicide is there. So what we have here on the left is a thistle plant that's actually just in the process of bolting. So you can see really the herbicide has only gotten into these 3 leaves. Where if we make an application to an herbicide in the rosette stage, which we've got here, so they made the application right here, you can see much more shadow, much more translocation of that herbicide to leaves, but also more importantly into these roots, which you see are much darker, indicating much more herbicide in there. So making that application when the plants aren't in bloom is going to work better. Fall applications are really good for Canada thistle control. Musk thistle is another type of thistle. This is not as problematic in terms of how invasive it can be to a field because it's not going to be spreading via rhizomes. This is a biennial, so it's got a taproot, and once the seed establishes, it's just one single solitary plant. See the flower on the musk thistle is much larger and kind of has this nodding kind of a way that it forms there. Bull thistle is another one, a biennial taproot species. Again, can be tough to control, but not going to be nearly as invasive as these rhizomes, that form these just dense mats of Canada thistle. So rhizomes being underground stems. Mugwort is another common one, very similar in growth habit and how it invades to Canada thistle, right? You get one plant in there and then you get these rhizomes that just run amok through the place. And herbicide wise, it's a little bit tougher to control where you're going to rely on herbicides like triclopyr or aminopyrrolid for control of this. All right, so moving to summer, let's talk about more weeds with spines on them. Horse nettle. So this is a summer perennial. So again, much like Canada thistle, it's got rhizomes underground, and we're going to need not just our, more economical 2,4-D and dicamba herbicides. We're going to need things like triclopyr and aminopyrrolid that ideally are applied in late summer, or even during the summer. But a combination of those herbicides plus more frequent mowing, so that 3 to 4 times per year mowing will make this horse nettle a lot less competitive. It just doesn't like the mowing quite as much as our grasses do. All right, so again, just stepping up to, 2,4-D and dicamba aren't going to have a lot of control, provide a lot of horse nettle control. Next, I want to talk about summer annuals. So we're moving from a perennial, which again survives underground via rhizomes in the winter. The perennials, again, germinate from seed in the spring, grow through the summer. They produce seed at the end of the summer, and then they die at the first frost, typically. So again, they're surviving the winter just solely via seed, which is an advantage for us if we're managing these. We can get a foothold in there. Right, so here's foxtail, here's giant foxtail. I'm just showing some pictures of these. Barnyard grass is a common summer annual. I don't believe particularly problematic, but foxtails are problematic. These awns, the animals don't like to chew them. They can really irritate the gums and the digestive tract, those sorts of things. Yellow foxtail, green foxtail. There's a lot of different foxtails. We don't really need to get into the nitty-gritty of identification necessarily. Giant foxtail is probably going to be the most obnoxious. We've also got paspalum species. These are perennials. I don't consider these huge problems in pastures because they are not bad forage. I'm going to kind of move over these for the sake of time. Another common summer annual is Japanese stiltgrass. We'll talk about how to control annuals in a little bit. You might see this. One that's moving into the area, and I've gotten some photos of this from Burlington County. Another summer annual is small carpet grass, or sometimes called joint head arthraxum. You can see these large, wide leaves that kind of look like tongues. Again, this is a summer annual that can really become quite invasive. So the thing about grasses versus broadleaves, we talked about a lot of different broadleaf herbicides, but there are no selective post-emergence herbicides for grass control in pastures. So once that foxtail's up or whatever it is, we can't spray anything on it that will kill the foxtail and not our desirable forage post-emergence, right? There is one pre-emergence option for annual grass control. So these pre-emergence herbicides, this pre-emergence herbicide is the only one labeled in pastures. You can see some of the information from the label there, but it can control the weed before it emerges from seed in the springtime. So it's not going to control perennials, and it really is only going to control annual grasses. But if you've got real big problems with foxtail, what you'll want to do is, or crabgrass or whatever it is, weeds that, again, warm season weeds that outcompete our desirable forage and then leave the ground bare in the winter. What you'll want to do is look at a fall seeding program, probably followed by a spring application of this pre-emergent herbicide Prowl H2O. There's no pre-harvest or pre-grazing interval for it, but the key is we need to apply it before we even see these tiny little weed seedlings in the soil. Okay, it's a pre-emergent herbicide, so it needs to be applied before we can see the weed. And I'll talk about timing in a second, but basically this is an herbicide we apply. This, if you imagine this is the forage and this is the soil, we apply it. We have to water it in with rainfall, ideally. It forms this barrier in the top part of the soil, basically for a period of a couple months. It binds to the organic matter in the soil. Then the weeds, seeds that are in there, so if we've applied this in, say, March or April, and those foxtail seedlings germinate in April or May, as that root comes out of that foxtail seedling, it won't be able to grow through this herbicide barrier, and it dies, basically. So that's kind of how it works. Here's a look at a perennial grass just trying to grow through it. You get those clubbed roots. But the herbicide does break down eventually. So you could seed into it in the fall following the spring application. But when do we want to make these applications of pre-emergence herbicide if we've had problems with annual grasses? We want to be making these applications typically in New Jersey. We've got a lot of forsythia on the East Coast when it's in full bloom. This is typically early to mid-April. So when you see this forsythia plant in full bloom, that's a good time to make those applications and hopefully get it watered in with the rain. Basically, this is based on soil temperatures that get to more than 55 degrees for a few days in a row. But again, it's easier just to use these plant phenological indicators, I think, than to try to measure soil temperature. So, okay, so we talked about weeds of summer, which then we kind of went back to the spring because that's actually when we want to control some of those weeds. And now we're back and we're talking about weeds of fall. There's not usually a ton of weeds that we haven't already talked about that are hugely problematic in the fall, but it is a great time for weed control of our perennials, things like Canada thistle, horse nettle. So maybe we decided to make an application in the spring or the summer for horse nettle or thistle, but likely we're going to need more than one application. And fall is a really great time. I'm talking probably, mid-September, as long as the weeds are still green and haven't started to go dormant. So what do we have for herbicides, right? Basically in pastures, we have a pretty limited list of herbicides, of selective herbicides, and it's really, we talked about, it's all just broadleaf control product except for the one grass product we talked about, right? So we've got 2,4-D, which is our most economical. Dicamba is pretty economical as well. Some of those weeds, like we talked about, Canada thistle, mugwort, horse nettle, you're going to want to find a product that has 2,4-D and maybe dicamba, but also has either triclopyr, clopyrrolid, or particularly aminopyrrolid is good. But there's some challenges with aminopyrrolid. If you start looking at the label in terms of what you can do with the manure and that kind of thing, because the herbicide is pretty persistent in foliage. So the key thing is most of these herbicide products are mixtures of 2 to 3 active ingredients. Because particularly with these 3 here, triclopyr, clopyrrolid, aminopyrrolid, I talked about them as really good on certain weeds, right? Really good on thistle, really good on horse nettle, but they might miss things like buttercups, and they have very specific, weeds that they're good on, and then other weeds they completely miss on. Whereas 2,4-D is kind of more of a generalist, right? It'll kind of injure certain things, injure almost everything to some extent, and then it'll on its own take care of most of our weed problems. So again, we're mixing things like 2,4-D, dicamba, or whatever to try to get broad spectrum weed control and also control those really tough to control weeds. I haven't talked a lot about metsulfuron because it does tend to stunt tall fescue a bit, and it's a little tricky in cool season pastures, but this is another very effective product, particularly if you're in warm season pastures, very effective against a large number of broadleaf weeds and even some of those brush problems. Non-selective, which would be this is going to kill anything that it basically comes in contact with. Glyphosate or Roundup is an excellent option if we're going to spot treat, particularly problematic tree saplings or those sorts of things. I know it's getting a lot of bad press, but it's very safe and it's very effective systemic herbicides. So again, kind of breaking it down here, right? Economical products versus those that have better efficacy. This is just same list, but just trade names on it. I know 2,4-D gets a lot of negative press, and I just want to address that very quickly because most of that negative, all those toxic effects were tied to when it was produced for the war effort in Vietnam in the 1960s as Agent Orange, which was 2,4-D plus 2,4,5-T. And what they figured out is when they were rushing production of this herbicide as part of the war effort, not being as careful with the reactions, they actually got a lot of dioxin as a byproduct of that. And they learned that that was actually, associated with all the toxicity and everything with that. So 2,4,5-T, which is this one, tended to have a little bit more dioxin byproduct, so it's no longer made. And again, 2,4-D, very safe product. You can read the label. It's labeled for use in pastures. And you can look at the grazing restrictions. Again, for horses, if you look at the grazing restrictions on labels, product herbicide labels, you generally, a rule of thumb is using the interval for lactating dairy animals, which is the most conservative. And again, if it were me and I was applying one of these products, I would probably make the application and then also wait for some rainfall, even just 1/10 or 1/4 of an inch of rainfall to wash that product off the leaves. And that would be, again, more caution than is required by the label. But if you're not really sure about these things, that's another step you can take in, and that rainfall will, for most of these herbicides, eliminate probably 99% of it from the foliage. And this is coming from some North Carolina state data. Organic herbicide options, they are very limited. They are all non-selective, so they will kill any foliage that they come in contact with. This is an example of a trial we did this summer. This is horticultural vinegar. It did burn down everything very quickly, but these are non-systemic products. So especially in the summertime, this is just 6 days after treatment. This is crabgrass we sprayed with that horticultural vinegar, and it had already basically regrown from it. So these organic options are maybe good on small seedlings, but remember, they're non-selective. So anything you spray them on, they're going to be equally toxic to the desirable grass or the weed. So generally, I would try to avoid these things and use selective options. Here's an example of a bare ground product that we looked at in the same trial. This is a synthetic product, which might be an option if you're looking at weed control along fence lines and that kind of thing. But I'm getting a little off topic and running out of time. So, talked a lot about weeds. What about, we talked about good quality forage and do I want to renovate? These are some very general rules of thumb, but if weeds are less than 30% of the pasture, you can probably increase the vigor of that desirable grass and get it to fill in those gaps with herbicides and improve management. If weeds are more than 50% of the pasture, particularly if the weeds are really noxious and difficult to control, then you'll want to look at maybe total renovation, followed by seeding. Again, this all needs to be in the fall to allow that seed to mature, that kind of thing. So look at some of the resources from the Equine Science Center that are really good on how do we encourage good quality forage and do it with animal care in mind. So here's a summary, right? Weed control in pastures is challenging due to overgrazing, limited mowing, and just a few herbicides registered, especially for grass control. So those are my take-home points, and I'm happy to take any questions that we have with the remaining time. And if Carrie, if I missed anything, there wasn't a question, let me know too.
Oh, there's tons of questions. So thank you very much. Thank you. So go ahead and why don't you stop sharing your screen, and I will start throwing out some of the questions. Since we only have 5 minutes, I did mention to Matt earlier that once we start the next speaker, he's going to log on to the question list and target some of the ones that we haven't gotten to. And I've also started answering some of the ones that I felt comfortable enough asking. So Matt, I think the first one is region specificity. And I know you mentioned we are in New Jersey, so a lot of these are more applicable to New Jersey, but can you actually talk about where some of these other weeds might be found, or if they apply other places, say like the Midwest or out east or out west?
Yeah, generally a lot of the weeds that I talked about are going to be problematic all the way until we get so far west that the precipitation really declines, and then you start to see different things. But up through Minnesota, all the way west to, I don't know about Montana, you got a lot of different stuff out there. I saw that state earlier, but if we get to even Iowa, that kind of Midwest where we've still got good precipitation, these are going to be common weeds in those areas.
Awesome. And what about, can you talk a bit about grazing restriction on some of these herbicides? I know you mentioned some are only permitted in pastures, but what about some grazing restrictions? How long do you have to keep horses off of the pastures?
So most labels do not mention anything about horses. And there's a really great fact sheet from the University of Kentucky, which is actually where I pulled that table on grazing restrictions. So that has some good guidance on there in terms of how do we approach this in terms of horses, because there's nothing on these product labels, and it mentioned using the lactating dairy animal because that's the most restrictive. The thing you can always do is read the labels of these products before you apply them, or before, even if you've got a licensed applicator you're hiring, which is a good way to do this a lot of times. Just read the label, follow those restrictions. And again, it does get a little bit complicated with some of these more persistent herbicides that are like Milestone or the aminopyrrolid, which is really good on some weeds, but one of the drawbacks is that, for example, once the horse has grazed on the forage, the herbicide can actually persist in the manure, and so you have to be careful about where do you take the manure. You know, if you put it on your vegetable garden, then you're going to kill the vegetables. So there's pros and cons to you know, using some of these herbicides where, you know, 2,4-D is not very persistent at all. So yeah, just checking the labels on those is really the best way to go about it. And that fact sheet from Kentucky basically summarizes what's on the labels, but it gives you a good place to start if you're trying to select a product.
Super, thank you. What about this one? This is interesting. What weeds, are there any weeds that shouldn't be mowed?
It's a good question. Some weeds can be a little bit more competitive if you mow them, but most of the ones in pastures are not that way. So generally, you know, like a lot of the foxtails and things, they're not going to be hurt or helped or harmed by mowing, but things like horse nettle would definitely be negatively impacted. Thistles probably by mowing. I don't believe any of them that I talked about today would be enhanced by mowing. So if that helps.
Yeah, so originally there was a lot of questions on buttercups, but I think you covered most of them, except for this one. What exactly causes the inundation of buttercups? Is it just the overgrazing, or is it lack of pH or other things in the soil?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not aware of anything in the soil that's going to maybe shift the advantage in favor of buttercups. But once you get some plants in there, then they produce a pretty good amount of seed and they can spread throughout the pasture, and they're going to really take hold anywhere you've got kind of open soil, particularly in late summer when those seeds establish. So they won't establish in a really dense, you know, Salfesky stand, for example, but they will establish if it's been overgrazed. And so you might not notice when they get established in the fall, but then, you know, they establish in the fall, grow through the winter, produce a whole bunch of seed in the springtime, and spread that way. So they're more prolific via seed, whereas you got something like Canada thistle, where one seed or two seeds might get in there and establish, and then the whole thing spreads via rhizomes or vegetatively. So that's kind of the big difference there.
Got it. Well, I will let you rest your voice and move on to our next speaker, but thank you so much,
Yeah,
Dr. Elmore. I
thanks
do
for
see
having
you
me.
have an awful lot of questions that are still coming in, so if you don't mind taking a peek at the Q&A, that would be great.
Yeah,
I know definitely a lot on foxtail. It seems
okay.
to be a big issue.
Yeah, I do get a lot of questions about that. And I forgot to mention county extension agents within RCE are really good. That's how I get a lot of my questions. So if you got a question on weed ID or whatever, reach out to your county agent. But yeah, I'll definitely field those questions. So thank you everyone
Awesome.
for the
And yeah, if you
questions.
don't mind too, for those that might have more questions for you, to put your email in the
Yeah,
chat. I know that could be opening a can of worms, but if you don't mind, that way
that's
everybody makes sure they get their questions answered. So thank you
great. Yeah, I had it as my last slide, but I didn't get to my last slide. It was the
so much.
next slide, and I said we'll just cut it off. So I'll put it in the chat here.
All right. Well, while you're doing that, I'm going to call up our next speaker, Dr. Bob Coleman. I will give him an introduction while he's going and adding his slides to our screen. So we are continuing on with our pasture management theme. And I failed to mention at the very beginning that that is our theme for this first webinar series, if you haven't already noticed. But we've taken all of the last 3 years of recommended topics for both the live and the virtual versions, and I've come up with some of the most commonly asked for topics, and pasture management was a big one. So that's why we're focusing on it today. So Dr. Bob Coleman's associate professor at the University of Kentucky. Bob Coleman grew up in Western Canada. And I know we have some Canadian questions in the chat box too, or in the Q&A, so maybe you'll be able to answer some of those. In Western Canada with a lifelong interest in horses. He's a graduate of the University of Manitoba with a bachelor's degree in agriculture with a major in animal sciences and a master's degree in animal science focused on nutrition. Dr. Coleman worked as a nutritionist for 2 major Canadian feed companies before moving to Alberta, and in 1980 served as the extension horse specialist for Alberta agriculture. During his time in Alberta, he completed his PhD at the University of Alberta with a focus on equine nutrition. And then in 1998, he moved to University of Kentucky as their equine extension specialist. He also teaches equine science and management program. Dr. Coleman has written several extension publications, and several is probably way too few. He's written quite a few extension publications on a variety of topics: nutrition, management, and facilities. Professionally, Dr. Coleman is a member of the Equine Science Society, serves as their director, as well as a member of the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists, and in the American College of Animal Science and the American Society of Animal Scientists. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Coleman.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. It's a pleasure to be here and to participate in such a lively program. It's certainly a challenging topic. Part of the time when I was putting this together and thinking about it, it's maybe not exactly my forte, but it's, as Dr. Williams said, I've been doing extension work a long time, and there's a lot of times that questions about how do we do things and what's the best way to do things on our farm keep coming up. And so I guess what I like about extension is it gives us a great opportunity to be that continual learner. So I'm going to share some things tonight. And first I thought, so pasture management, from this perspective, what exactly does that mean? What would you think about? How do I put that into perspective? And certainly, you know, a successful management plan, I would hope we would have a really good forage stand. And as our last speaker kept reminding us, that if we have a really good forage stand, maybe we can control some of those plants that we don't want. You might call them weeds. Some people might not call them weeds, but maybe we don't have to deal with them quite so much because we have a really good, vibrant and vigorous forage stand. It would be really helpful if our horses would have a uniform grazing pattern and be a little less selective in what they choose. But that would be the same as suggesting that when we go to the buffet, that we take a little bit of everything rather than only selecting what we like. There's a lot of times that, you know, we kind of, or at least some of us, and I would be speaking for myself, kind of go quickly past the salad and the vegetables and get to the, you know, fried chicken and the roast beef. But, you know, if we need to think about those grazing patterns, because one of the things you'll see with a lot of pastures is that we do get the formation of what we call lawns and roughs. And while some people think that is formed because of poor manure management, in a lot of cases it actually is also exacerbated because the horses will choose to eat what they think is the most palatable and maybe leave some of the other that now grows and gets a little rank and becomes unpalatable, and they leave that becomes the rough area. So that's something to think about. In the work that I've done with pasture management, manure management always seems to come up, and there's always that debate about, you know, how do I deal with that? And there's some new pieces of equipment that are coming out. There's some old pieces of equipment that can be used. But with all of these things, when we look at the equipment we're going to use to manage our pastures, you know, timing becomes critical. You know, when are we going to do things? How are we going to plan for it? And what are we going to use? So we need to think about looking at making selections of equipment and how we're going to use that equipment so that we do keep that forage stand good. Maybe we can help encourage our horses to graze in a little bit better way. That is a challenge. I'm trying to tell them to, no, you need to go over and eat that other green stuff, and they may or may not want to listen to you. And then certainly, how do we deal with the manure? So from an equipment standpoint, this almost becomes like your Christmas list. What do you need and what do you want? I probably should have put another word in there. What can you afford, or what do you want to afford? But I think when we look at it and we look at the kind of equipment that we need, the size, uh, will depend on sort of the total acreage that we're going to deal with. We need to think about our grazing acres. You know, how much are we actually using for our pastures? Do we have any topography issues? There are parts here in Kentucky that we sort of kind of joke that the land is really level. It just, or it's flat, but it happens to be at about a 40-degree incline. So we do have some hill issues and some things that how we manage that rougher terrain can be a little more of a challenge. And do we have other unique issues? Our previous speaker talked about sort of that, how things change. You know, do we have some woods that we have to worry about the encroachment of some of that plant material into our grazing areas? Do we have areas that get wet that we need to think about how we're going to manage around that, and think about the equipment that we might need in relationship to that? And then certainly here in Kentucky, one of the sort of unique areas in your acreage that you have to think about are, do you have sinkholes? Because sinkholes have been known to swallow up everything from, you know, tractors to horses. And so understanding where that is and how that may actually limit our available acreage, but also limit how we manage that acreage, becomes really something that we have to think about. I always think of one of my extension questions, and we always get ones that are really interesting. And in extension, it's not uncommon that you suggest that you should have 2 acres of land for each horse. So I had a horse owner call, and I could tell that this was something to do with wanting to get more horses. So the question was, is it 2 acres per horse? And they said, well, it can be. And they told me that, well, we have 24 acres. So that means I can have 12 horses, correct? Well, it's like, well, I don't like where this is going, because then as we talked, we found out that she had 4 acres of woods and a 7-acre pond. So now we went from 24, we just took off 11, and no, she couldn't have all 12 horses, which I think she was very disappointed with, but that was the reality, because while she had the total acreage, she did not have the grazing acreage that she needed. So our previous speaker talked a little bit about mowing, and that's certainly something that we can do. And if we do it appropriately, it certainly can help our forage stand. We can keep it from going mature. We can keep it vegetative. We can keep it growing. We can keep it potentially more palatable to the horses, and we can keep things more even. One of the things that I have found that mowing will help to reduce some of the lawns and some of the roughs, so that we have that area that is quite tall, that the horses, for whatever reason, have chosen not to go and graze in that part of the pasture. It could be anything from they don't like it over there, it's a low spot over there, maybe the bugs are worse, it's too close to the road. There's a lot of things that us trying to second guess why the horses won't go to that back pasture is far beyond what we can do. But if they don't go back there and they don't graze there, then that grass is going to get tall, and they probably aren't going to go there unless we do some other things that we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. I think you want to set your height for grazing. I typically use 4 inches, but I want 4 inches as an average over the grazing area. So just because one part of it is at 4 inches, but another part is 6 or 8 inches, and you say, well, they can just go over and eat that tall stuff. They probably won't. They're going to stay at that 4-inch area until they graze it down to probably almost bare ground. So when it is on average, we're down to 4 inches, it's time to move the horses off and potentially do some mowing so that we can now get it back to a much even acreage across the whole grazing area. And certainly, as was mentioned, if you're doing some rotation, that gives you an opportunity to control grazing to a certain extent and make better use of your acreage, because they're going to graze where you would like them to a certain degree, and not just where they want to. So when we look at a mower, and there's lots of choices, and I see a lot more where people are using some of the more lawn associated mowers for mowing their pastures, which, yes, it will work. There are those things that you can use. I'm not going to say that you can't. I think you need to think about exactly what it is you're trying to get done, and how long is it going to take. So we look at a lot of those, your decks is going to be anywhere from 48 to 60 inches. You might get some that are a little bigger than that. Again, depending on the mower that you choose. I think it's very important that you can set your deck height, so you can control how short or tall you're mowing, so that you stay at that 4 inches and you don't get too low. There are some that you'll look at it and it will tell you right on the specs of the mower that can be raised up to 4.5 inches. So that would be a positive thing. And just because we've said 4 inches is where we want to aim for, that doesn't mean that you couldn't go at 4.5 inches. You might want to go a little taller than that, because of it is a better way to control grazing across your whole pasture. But you don't want those mowers that, if they're mowing everything at 3 inches or less, over time, that's going to end up being pretty damning and detrimental to your forage stand. So you do need to leave a reasonable amount of forage material so you get regrowth and you maintain a viable and a healthy stand. If you look at some of the rotary mowers, they might be a little bit bigger. So you'll get some that can be as big as 7 feet. You can actually get the big bat wings, like in the previous picture, where, I mean, that mows a lot of ground. It takes a very big tractor to get that done. So for a lot of us, depending on what a small farm actually is to us, we're probably looking in that 7 to 8 foot for a rotary mower, if that's what we're going to look for. They are adjustable, so you can set the height, which makes it really good. Generally, not all of them, but the majority of them are going to operate off a 3-point hitch off a tractor. So that means that your mowing machine, your tractor, needs to be of suitable size to handle the mower. And a rule of thumb that you can use is that while your tractor may have 30 horsepower, you need to know what the horsepower at the PTO is, because it's going to be different and it's usually less. And you would like to have 5 horsepower at the PTO for every foot of mower to have enough capacity in the tractor to handle the mower appropriately and actually drive it and get it to work the way you want it to. So a lot of times people will forget to ask that when they'll look at a tractor and say, I think this would be really great on my small farm. And a lot of them would be very good. But then you look at what capacity that tractor has for any of the implements that you might want to use, and it might not be there. I took my grandson to a farm supply store on the weekend, and he fell in love with one of the small tractors, and he said, well, you could get this and then we could get this mower. I said, well, you could, except that tractor's not big enough to actually run that mower. And so trying to explain to a 9-year-old the whole 5 horsepower per foot of mower was a little bit of a challenge, but it really did show that while there was a lot of things about that tractor that you would really like, it might not have the capacity to run a rotary mower. And then you might be looking, why does he have pasture gate written there? Make sure that what you are going to be going into your pastures to mow will fit through the gate. Just because somebody told you it was 12 feet, if you have more than 12 feet of vehicle, make sure that it'll fit. There's a lot of times people will sort of wonder about which I should get and then have trouble getting through the gate. Not an uncommon problem that we see on lots of small farms is we just aren't thinking about how we're going to get in and out with what we have to get in and out with. This is a novel mower, and when I was putting this together, and so thank you, Dr. Williams, for forcing me to go and do some research, but I found this to be really interesting. So it is a gas-powered mower. You need a tow vehicle, so you can pull it behind your ATV is in the picture. It will handle about an acre per hour, which is a reasonable capacity. It's a little more heavy duty than, say, some of the zero turns or some of the garden tractor style mowers. So it has pretty good capacity. Again, if we had some of those small shrubs or some bigger weeds or some other things that we were trying to clean an edge up, it may give us that. The big thing is that you're going to go at about an acre per hour. So depending on how many acres you have to mow will then dictate how many hours you're going to spend on your ATV. But a new addition, and again, a piece of equipment for those that are on a smaller acreage, smaller budget, maybe don't need a big tractor. Maybe that small tractor that I looked at on the weekend might be something that could handle this kind of a mower, and it may make for a reasonable purchase for my equipment budget. So we have lots of people, and there's lots of these, the ride-on, the zero turns. They have pretty good capacity for their deck. There's limits to the adjustment. I do think you have to think about the topography that you have for the area that you're going to be mowing, and is this equipment going to be stable enough and safe enough to be used for mowing the ground that you need to mow? We need to think about those sorts of things and make sure that we are able to handle what we need to get done. I found it interesting when you look at a lot of the directions and the product information sheets. These typically suggest that they're recommended for mowing acreages of 1 to 4 acres. So again, depending on the size of small farm that you have, the amount of mowing that you need to do, you could maybe look at one of these, and it might be something that could be worthwhile, but I think you need to put it into perspective of, this is the job I need to get done. Is this the best use of my resources to get that job? Because if you look at, in some cases, you might be able to pull something behind that zero turn or that ride-on tractor, but what kind of capacity do I have to pull anything with this? Is that really what this piece of equipment is used for? And is it the best way to make that kind of a decision? Is that the best, being a good consumer to do that? Now, I know there are some of the zero turns that are very large. I know some of the thoroughbred farms and some of the other farms in the Lexington area on the smaller paddocks that they have, maybe closer to the barn or closer to the house. They will mow them with a zero turn. I know people that have a little larger ride-on tractor, has that 60-inch deck. They spend a lot of time mowing grass, and they're happy doing that. But is that a good use of resources to get that done? So we've mowed it. One of the things that I like to do and suggest when on a rotational system is that if I'm moving from one paddock to the next, when the horses come off that paddock, I like to mow it to get everything evened up at my 4-inch level, and then I'm going to drag it. And I'm going to drag it so that I can distribute the manure, because that's one of my manure management things, or I can maybe look at something and pick it up to remove it. Now, one of the things is that if I've used some of those herbicides that we just learned about that may have some residual and may be in the manure, if you distribute it back onto the property or that ground where that herbicide was sprayed, that's not going to be a big issue. It's when you potentially pick it up and you're going to compost it, you're going to put the compost back on your pastures, that's reasonable. But if you are going to do as it was suggested, you're going to put it into your garden, or you give it to your neighbors and they put it in their roses, and now all of a sudden their roses are dead. You're not going to be very popular. So you need to think about, what am I going to do with that manure? But I do think that you have to either pick it up and remove it, or you need to distribute it, or you find that it doesn't go away very easily. And when it is hot and dry and you're not careful, it won't go away. And then what does it do? Well, it smothers the grass underneath it. And for some reason, the grass won't grow through that manure pile, but the weeds will. So you need to do that. I do want to make a point that mowing is not effective or doesn't affect your manure management. If you are mowing close enough that you're scattering manure piles, you are mowing way too close. So a lot of people think, well, I'll just mow it and that's will distribute it. And no, it won't, because you're not mowing that close. So if you're going to drag it when it's hot and dry, and certainly on a rotational system, if you give it probably 3 weeks to closer to 4 weeks, but certainly 3 weeks is a good minimum. As far as a parasite management practice, if it's hot and dry out, most of those parasite larvae don't have enough energy resources stored up that they're not going to last more than about 2.5 to 3 weeks. And if it's hot, they are not going to survive. And so it's worrying about spreading it all over your fields and spreading parasites is probably not a major concern, but you don't want to be doing it when it's really moist out. You want to wait till it's starting to get hot and dry. So you can use a chain drag. These are pretty simple. You just need something like the chain harrows. I think they work reasonably well. They also will move and give you a little bit of extra use if you need to disturb the soil a little bit, because all of a sudden I have a rescue seeding that I need in the spring. Dragging your chain drag over and kind of opening up the bare ground and then putting the seed down, and then you can actually use the chain drag to cover it back up. But as I said, it's timing. You have to do this when it is hot and dry, but you still need to have, you need to think about doing it. And I think that a lot of the chain drags, there's some new ones coming out, probably not for a small horse farm, because looking at them, they're a fairly substantial piece of equipment, and it takes a fairly substantial tractor to actually drag them appropriately. I was watching one of the videos from a new company's one. I would say that their chain drag is moderately aggressive. It seemed that it really was doing a lot of moving things around. Certainly did disturb any of the manure that was there, disturbed a lot of the ground, may open up some bare ground, unfortunately, which could aid with some of those weeds to get a foothold if there's not enough grass there. So something to have. I think you want ones that does have some teeth in it. The nice thing about these is you can turn them over. You don't always have to run it with the teeth down. You can run it the other way. And I think they have enough weight to actually get the job done. Whoop. Whoa. This is new. I don't know if any of you have seen these new paddock scoops. That these are the two that I could find. So the paddock blade comes in different colors. I think the yellow one only comes in yellow and maybe one other one. Great for in a paddock situation to collect manure. They will also pick up a lot of other things. If you watch the videos, they demonstrate where they pick up a whole bunch of pieces of brick, pieces of tree, all sorts of things. I would look at it and kind of question how it would work on your facility. Certainly you need a tow vehicle, but they usually use an ATV. Actually, one of them was pulling it with their zero turn mower, so they can't be too heavy to pull. Look like they're pretty easy to deal with. I would wonder if there was any variation in how effective these are as it relates to the level of plant material in the area that you are dragging. If you've still got, 5 or 6 inches of forage left, how effective they would be, and if they start to float a little bit where they might not actually gather up the fecal material you want. I would also want my ground to be fairly flat, and make sure that so that that blade stays where you want it to and can pick it up. But certainly an interesting idea and something that would clean up a paddock, clean up an area that maybe you have a sacrifice area that's a little harder ground. You might be able to clean that up very quickly. Certainly a lot easier driving your zero turn or your ATV than pushing the wheelbarrow with a shovel and a rake. So something to look at. Whether it would work for you or not, I think you really have to be a good consumer and ask some questions about how it works on the topography and the land that you have to see if that's what it is. They suggest that you certainly could then gather up the fecal material, take it over to your compost pile. But again, be aware if you've been using herbicides that you might have to think about where that compost ends up going. But a novel and a new way for us to take care and manage our pastures, and in particular, deal with manure, because that is a challenge. So for a lot of these, we need something to be our tow vehicle. We're starting to see, again, a lot more smaller tractors in that 25 to 35 to 40 horsepower range. A lot of them come, have the capacity for a bucket. They have a PTO, so that gives us some opportunities and some options to do some different things. If you have equipment like a mower that needs a 3-point hitch, you have that. Again, depending on the topography of your land, maybe a 2-wheel or maybe a 4-wheel drive is something that, again, options that will help you to take care and manage the ground in an effective and a good manner. I think you look at the kind of tractor, the size of tractor that you need, whether it's new or used. Certainly that is up to the individual, but I do see now that there's a lot more choice of those smaller size tractors that would give you great opportunities to manage your small farm in a very effective way. Now, biggest problem is, will they fit in the budget or not? Because as with everything that we're seeing today, none of this stuff is inexpensive. But certainly something to think about as to what is available and making sure that it is big enough, but not oversized. So some opportunities there. Other things that you can use, and when you look at these, and I sort of tried to figure out exactly how do you quantify these and describe them. So we have the all-terrain vehicles, there's the utility terrain vehicles, there's the side-by-side, there's a mule, there's a gator, there's all sorts of things. And a lot of times when you look at them, other than maybe the ATVs, they all seem to look the same. So trying to figure out, is this something that would be beneficial for my management plan? Will this be the tow vehicle for the equipment that I am going to use to manage my pasture? So will my UTV pull my chain drag effectively? Could I use my UTV or my ATV to pull that gas-powered mower? Is that something that would be really useful for what I would like to get done? Would it be a way that I can take care of the pasture in an effective way? So again, not unlike the tractor, but you got to make sure, is what I'm getting big enough with enough capacity to deal with the implements that I want it to pull? By and large, probably yes. But am I going to be towing things? Do I need to worry about other capacities? One of the things that you'll see on some of these, particularly the UTVs, there are now some really good spray systems that fit in the back of a UTV. Small capacity, but big enough for those that may be having a 5 to 10 acre pasture from a spray standpoint. So they're a lot better than having a backpack sprayer, but those also have some spot spraying capabilities, and they work really well off of one of these smaller modes of transportation. So putting it in your mule or your gator or on the UTV, and certainly if the UTV has the ability either from a battery standpoint to run that sprayer, could be something that could again be very effective in how you manage your pastures. But looking at them, like the tractors and like all the other things, when you price some of these, I think you have to look at it and say, for what it costs me to buy one of these, will I get enough done, and will I have enough flexibility in order to keep doing what I need to manage my pastures so that I have good stand in controlling lawns and roughs, and I'm handling my manure management. So looking at the capacity for the job, and I think this goes with everything, whether it be a ride-on tractor, a regular tractor, or one of these smaller modes of transportation. Is it going to do the job that I want to in relationship for what it's going to cost? I haven't priced these out for a while, but a while back I did for another program, and in some cases, I could almost buy a small used truck for what the UTV was going to cost. So it's like, wow, they can get expensive in a hurry. Now, some other things that are different than from a management standpoint, but I think they're items that we should think about. Can we use temporary fencing in order to have flexibility in how we manage our pastures so that we can work on a good stand? We can work on reducing or trying to control those lawns and roughs. I'm not going to do anything about the manure management, but it does give us some flexibility in how we deal with our grazing patterns. So we can control access to areas in the pasture. We might actually be able to encourage our horses to go to a part of the pasture that, well, it's not their favorite. They're willing to go if we suggest it to. So having some temporary fencing is something that could work reasonably well for us. The big thing with this, and with any rotational system, I hear people all the time say, oh, it's really simple. You just have to move horses from one spot to the other. It's simple, but it does take time and effort. You need to be prepared to walk your pastures, check what's going on, and make sure that when it's time to move from one paddock to the next, that you're on top of that and that you can do it effectively so that, again, you're not going to overgraze, you're not going to do things that are detrimental to the quality of your pastures. How you do it, I mean, there again this has exploded. There is a plethora of posts that you can get. Some that people like, some that people don't like. When we look at the posts, we go from one side to the next. We have the step-in post, we have the drive-in fiberglass posts. Those are really nice for certain things, but if you're going to use a drive-in fiberglass post when you're putting them in, you better wear gloves because those fiberglass shards get in your like little slivers and they really hurt. And I'm telling you that from my experience, so you don't have to learn on your own. You can just take my experience and trust me because they do hurt. What am I going to use for my fencing? Am I going to use the tape, the rope, the wire? Again, what do you want to work with? But it is important to remember that if I'm going to use the rope, for example, so that would be that 6-strand poly rope, that I use a post that is designed to handle rope, and not all of them are. By the same token, if I buy rope acceptable posts but can't handle a tape, then I need to think about that. Get the posts that you find easiest to work with. I kind of like the ones, the black and the white ones that are on the far right of that whole group of posts, because you step it in by stepping right over top of the stake, and it's a lot easier to get them in. I always find those ones where you're stepping on the side, they never go where I want them to go, especially in Kentucky when the ground's hard. It's hard to get them in at the best of times. So think about that. This is a time to not be excessively frugal. Buy good posts. Buy the ones that have good UV protection. Get the ones that are going to work well for what you want to do. And then make sure that your energizer is strong enough to handle the amount of fence that you are needing to energize, so that when the horses get close to it, they realize that it's there. It is a both physical and a psychological barrier, and they leave it alone. But it really can give you an opportunity to move the grazing, not so much in the year. I mean, my thought is that, and when I do it, I set my grazing paddocks up, and they're good for the whole grazing season. All I do is move horses. I don't move fence till next year. But then I can go back in and say, I maybe need to do some renovation this fall on this part of it. And so I'm going to protect this part of my pasture for as long as I can. I'd like to protect it for a year and let it become well established before I use it again. And this temporary fencing will allow me to do that. So something to think about. With that is, how am I going to get my water to the horses? Now, I know the system that Dr. Williams has, and it is a beautiful system. Those best management practices truly are exactly that, best management practices. If I could have a permanent system where the horses could go to water and not have to worry about them beating up extra pasture or making paths, doing those sorts of things, very structured, I would really like to do that. That takes time, resources, and a lot of other things. Some of us don't have that opportunity. So what if we went with a portable system? So we could have a tank like the one on the right that happens to be a 60-gallon tank, works reasonably well, as long as you have enough horses, because certainly the capacity has to be there, that they get enough to drink when they want to. There's enough water pressure to keep it full quickly, and there's a lot of those things that you need to think about. But then when I need to move from one paddock to the next, I can empty it, move it over, plug it back into the water line, and refill it, and we're good to go. So that gives me a little bit of a flexibility in how I might be able to use different parts of the pasture and get more out of it, because I can move my waterer easily. Certainly, the permanent system is ideal, but this can actually work as well. The other nice thing, and you can kind of see that it has the yellow float. I really like that, because you can tell that the water is full from quite a ways away, which is really nice. The only thing is you can't tell how nasty the water might be. And probably the biggest thing we found with this is that water would get fairly warm in July in Kentucky. So need to think about that. The other thing is the water came in at the bottom. And so the float and the water valve and everything is at the bottom of the tank. So it kind of keeps it away from the horses. The gentleman that sold me this system said, yep, and there, you don't have to worry about the float. Horses can't do anything to it. And I had a horse that decided to eat the float. So don't believe everything that you hear or read. So, we'll go back. Well, we're almost at the end. What I think you need to think about is, what are your financial implications? Because you're going to have an investment in equipment. I think you want to look long-term, your pastures long-term. You don't want to be fixing things every year if you don't have to. Look at what makes the most sense for your small farm, and then invest appropriately. It might take a while, and you have to do some things in a different way early on, or you need to borrow things. But there are significant financial implications, and probably the biggest thing is your time. Time is a valuable commodity, and none of us have enough of it. But we're not getting any more. So we need to think about this. So sort of the last thing that I thought of is when I looked at that little gas-powered mower, and it was an acre an hour, and I thought, okay, an acre an hour. I have 5-acre paddocks, so that's going to take 5 hours of mowing. What could I do with my horses with those 5 hours? Is there something else I could be doing that would be as productive as mowing? Now, sometimes 5 hours on the tractor mowing and letting your mind think about whatever you needed to think about, or think about nothing, just listening to your podcast or a book on tape, that could be a valuable use of that 5 hours. But I think we need to look at that, and can we have our equipment and our management practices in a way that we make good use of our time and good use of our money. And so we'll leave with that. If there are opportunities, I know Dr. Williams and I talked about this earlier. I mean, we're all in extension. Feel free, if there's something that you would like to know, where did you get that picture? Where did you find that? Can I get a copy of something that you saw on the slides? Feel free to send me an email, and we will see if we can't put things together. So there we are. And
Awesome. Well,
on
thank
time.
you. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Yes, you are very on time. We've got plenty of time for questions. So you can go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm just going to throw it out there that if you do have questions for Dr. Coleman, I'm going to be looking at the Q&A box. So please go ahead and type them there. We do have some older questions, though, that were asked during the last speaker's talk, but I saved them because I think they're very appropriate for you. So the first thing, can you talk a little bit about pasture rotation and when to rotate? I know you mentioned the height of the grasses and things, but can you just mention that again about rotating of pastures?
I think it's a great technique. I like it so that I'm going to have an average of 4 inches of grass across my paddock. So that means that I walk my paddocks frequently and look at, and as I sort of alluded to, I might have some 2-inch down on the one side, and I've got 6 inches on the other side. So that means the average of my paddock is 4 inches, and it's time to move. I would love to be able to tell you that you should be able to move on Wednesday and every Wednesday thereafter. That doesn't work. Part of it is, what's Mother Nature going to do to me? And also, how much area do I have to move across? So the one year that we did, we started out, we had 5 acres of paddocks that we divided into 4 paddocks. So that's 1.25 acres per paddock. And hope everybody's sitting down. We had 15 adult thoroughbred mares on 1.25 acres at one time. They mowed better than any bush hog I've ever seen in my life. They cleaned it off. And we found that the one year we were going about every 8 days. But depending on what else we had to do, we might move them a day or two early. We might be able to stay a little longer. It really looked at how did the grass grow. But we tried to have a minimum of 3 weeks between, 3 weeks of rest. So that I can get my grass to come back. I can take care of any business that I need to. If I'm going to drag the pasture, I don't have to worry as much about the parasite issue and go that way. The very first year I did one, I had 2 weeks. I'd only had 2 horses on 2.5 acres, 3 paddocks. They grazed for 2 weeks. I moved them, so I had 4 weeks of regrowth before they went back. It was the perfect scenario. Started at 8 inches, grazed to 4, moved them, came back when there was at least 8. Did that from the 1st of May till the 1st of November. Left with 4 to 5 inches of grass across my 2.5 acres. It was perfect. So the next year I thought, well, I can do the same thing. I ran out of grass the 1st of July because it stopped raining. And so the 1st of July in Kentucky, I'm feeding hay because I sacrificed a third of my pasture. I decided I'm going to sacrifice one and try to save the other 2. And so I did that. So the rotation thing is really long because you do have to walk your pastures. When we do research, and I don't know, Dr. Williams, if you do it, but we were walking it every day.
Oh yeah.
Every day. That's the best beauty of grad students because my grad student she did 4 days, but I did 3 days, and I did Saturday and Sunday.
That was nice of you. I always gave them the weekends.
I did Saturdays and Sundays. Of course, we were right beside the faculty club, and if a horse was sleeping at brunch time, the dean would get a call about dead horses. So it's better for me to be there handling the dead horse calls. They weren't, but you got to walk it, and if anything, take them off sooner than later. Protect it because they will beat it up. They really will, and they'll get to a place that they like, and they won't leave it alone, regardless of what's there. So I like it. It's just you got to work hard and move your fence.
Sounds good. I have a couple more equipment questions, which I really want to get to. But before I see we have a few people dropping off, I put in the chat a link to our survey. So if everybody would it's like literally 5 quick questions. Just fill out that evaluation for the program about what you learned and what you want to see going forward. I would greatly appreciate it. So that is in the chat. And Kyle will probably, yep, there we go, put it in the chat again. So our next question, we got 3 dealing with either manure or equipment. So do you recommend pulling a drag behind you when you mow your pastures?
That's a great question. No, I don't. I mean, that would take a lot more capacity, and I may not be able to go as fast as I'd like to with my drag. And it also depends on what I'm dragging. So there's some people here that I think are more south might have Bermuda grass. You'll find that if you drag a Bermuda grass after you've mowed it, your drag's going to look like a cotton ball. You're going to pick up all sorts of stuff. The good news is you can get that off, and that's a good thing to do, is to get it off. It really does clean up your pasture. It comes back really nice. So I would drag it separately because that way I can go the direction I need to, and I can go the speed that I want to.
Good answer. What about thoughts on a pull behind mechanical spreader for manure?
A pull behind spreader, like a regular manure spreader to spread your compost?
What it sounds like.
That's right. I like those. I would have, and again, it depends on your ground and it depends on the vehicle. I actually think the manure spreader that runs off a power takeoff might be your better bet, because if it's ground driven and you have any amount of soft ground, I have seen some of those that are a little been overloaded, and you end up, if they catch it all, you're going to rut your pasture. So, I mean, good compost and a good manure spreader is a great way to do it. If you're going to use one that is ground driven, be very careful and don't overload it so that it actually will flow much easier, and you're not going to jam up your chain because you don't have the power takeoff pushing it.
Well, last one along those same lines is, if you are going to spread, how often?
Ooh.
These are these wonderful like extension answers. It depends.
It depends. It depends. It depends. It depends. I mean, it's good compost. I mean, it goes back to our first speaker. Tell me something about your soil test. Tell me what we're needing to put on and figuring out how we're going to do it and what's the most appropriate, because we're putting the compost on as much for its nutrient value. So let's figure out what the nutrient value needs to be, and then let's put it on appropriately. I think that, we spread fertilizer in a lot of cases once a year. I might put my compost on parts of the pasture, and that's the nice thing about that flexible fencing. Maybe I can put some on where I can leave it and keep the horses off for a while and actually let it work its way in and do its job. So I think it really boils down to how much you're trying to get rid of and what is reasonable to put on there. But I would like to know the nutrient value of my compost, and I would like to know the requirements for my ground. So I would like to have a soil test.
Yes. Good points, good questions. But last one coming in, we'll do it really quick because I know we're kind of right on time here. What about aeration of fields? How do you feel about that?
Every time I've talked to people about aeration, the answer is very mixed. It's either, well, it can work, or why are you doing that? I think you're probably, when you drag your pastures, you might do just as much good as actually worrying about the aeration. I'm not seeing from the forage guys that they're really big promoters of that, unless you end up that you've got some really hard packed ground that you just have to loosen up, and then aeration will actually do it. But hopefully you've got something that will actually get the job done, because it is a tough job on really hard ground, and it's really hard on equipment, and you better have the capacity of the equipment to actually do that, or you're wasting your time.
Great. Well, great answers, great questions. I am going to share my slides one more time and just like to wrap up for the day and say thank everybody for coming. We had great attendance. We had great speakers. I learned a lot. I love these sessions. So if you're interested in giving back to the Equine Science Center, please see us at the esc.rutgers.edu page. And for those of you who are more and don't want to click a link, you'd rather use your phone to take the survey, there is a QR code. We would love to have your participation in filling out the evaluation. I chose all of our topics this year based on the last 3 years of the evaluations. So if you want to hear something specific, go ahead and tell me all about it. I'll be asking you to do this. If you're here for the next two, I'll be asking you for the next two. But thank you again for joining us, and I really appreciate everybody's time. Have a good night.